The pen was already in my hand when the stranger's voice stopped me. Saturday, the last one in September, 1971, and the sale ring in Stanford smelled like it always did on auction days. Diesel, manure, and the particular sweat of men who'd been up since 4. I stood at the rail with the slaughter paper flat against a hay bale, the auctioneer's clerk waiting, tapping his own pen against a clipboard like he had somewhere better to be. Behind me, somebody laughed. Not quiet about it either. "Look at him drool," a heavy-set man in a canvas coat said to the fellow beside him, loud enough to carry. County Fair reject. He wasn't wrong to look. The bull, my bull now, 3 weeks into being mine, stood in the pen with his head low, jaw slack, a thread of saliva swinging off his lip. His left front hoof had split clean up the middle, the kind of split that doesn't heal so much as get managed, and it made him rock sideways when he walked, like a man favoring a bad knee. Somebody had scrawled a number on a card and hung it on the rail. $210. Slaughter weight. Nothing more. I was 18 years old and 6 weeks from owing the producer's feed company $460 I did not have, and $210 was $210. The clerk cleared his throat. "Son, you signing or not?" I picked up the pen. That's when I felt him, a man I hadn't noticed till he was already leaning on the rail beside me, elbow to elbow, close enough that his voice didn't have to travel far to reach only me. He was maybe 40, quiet dressed, no hat, a canvas satchel over one shoulder, like he'd come from an office and not a barn. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bull's hoof, and then, longer, at the tag clipped to its ear, the old brass one, dulled with age, that had come down with the herd from my grandfather's registry. "Don't sell him," he said. Just that, not loud. Not urgent even, though something underneath it was. I turned my head, and by the time I had, he was already straightening up, tucking the satchel strap higher on his shoulder, like a man who'd said what he came to say and didn't need to explain himself to a boy holding a pen over a slaughter paper. "Who are you?" I said, because it was the only thing I had. "Extension office," he said. "Livestock genetics. I'll find you Monday." And that was all. He walked off through the crowd, the way a man walks when he already knows something the rest of the... If you enjoy stories like this, I've put together a special collection called The Land They Laughed At. 15 original farm and homestead stories you won't find on this channel. You can read them or listen to the complete audiobook ad-free, with no interruptions. The link is in the description and pinned comment. The sale ring doesn't, and I stood there with the pen still in my hand, the clerk still waiting, the man in the canvas coat still laughing at my bull's drooling jaw, and something in my chest telling me to wait, just wait, before I signed anything at all. I didn't sign anything that day. I put the pen down on the clerk's clipboard and told him I needed to think, and he looked at me like thinking was a luxury a boy my age couldn't afford, not with a feed bill breathing down his neck. But my mind had already gone somewhere else, back 3 months, to a Tuesday that started like any other and ended with everything I owned changing hands. It was the 11th of August, 1971, a hot, dry Tuesday, with the kind of sky that made the Bridger foothills look close enough to touch, when my grandfather Otis Ridout sat down in his kitchen chair after morning chores and didn't get up again. Doc Hollenbeck said it was his heart, quiet and quick, the kind of death a man like that would have chosen if anyone had asked him. I was the one who found him, and I was the one who called Pruitt's funeral home in Stanford, and I was the one who sat in the front pew 9 days later while the county lawyer, a thin man named Everett Kalb, read out a will that left me the whole of it. 640 acres running along Willow Creek, 40 head of cattle carrying his brand, and a feed bill of $2,140 owed to the Stanford Co-op, due in 6 weeks whether I was ready or not. Nobody in the county thought I'd keep any of it. I was 18, and I'd spent more of my life in the schoolhouse in Stanford than I had on horseback, though my grandfather had made sure I knew which end of a shovel to hold. Still, the morning after the funeral, I walked the fence lines alone for the first time, as the man who owned them, not the boy who helped mend them. I remember the frost was already gone off the grass by the time I started, and the barbed wire hummed faint under my hand where the wind caught it, and every post I touched felt like it was asking me a question I didn't have an answer to yet. I walked past the north pasture where the bull, his bull then, not mine, stood alone by the creek, favoring that back hoof the way he always had, chewing slow like he had nowhere else in the world to be. I didn't know yet what was written down in the registry book in the house, the one with the brass-tagged bloodlines going back further than my grandfather's own memory. I only knew the feed bill, and the 6 weeks, and the weight of 640 acres pressing down on shoulders that had never carried anything heavier than a hay bale before. I finished the walk near dusk, my boots soaked through from the creek crossing, and stood at the gate, looking back at the house where he'd died, thinking that whatever this land wanted from me, I was going to have to learn it fast, because the bank in Stanford wasn't going to wait for me to grow into the job. The bull's name was Ezra. My grandfather's handwriting told me that much, stenciled in fading blue ink on a wooden tag wired to the pen post. I found it Tuesday morning, the 23rd of April, 1968, with frost still silvering the fence rail and my breath fogging in front of me. I stood outside the pen a long while before I went in, because everyone at the co-op sale barn had told me that animal was dangerous. Orville Tish said his hired man wouldn't go near him, said the bull had put a hoof through a gate panel the winter before, and near broke a man's arm doing it. But when I climbed through the rails that morning, slow, not looking him straight in the eye the way my grandfather used to do it, Ezra just turned his big head toward me and stood there, chewing, that ruined hoof cocked up off the ground like he was resting it. I put my palm flat against his shoulder, and he didn't flinch, didn't so much as shift his weight. He leaned into my hand, actually, the way a dog leans into a scratch behind the ears. I stood there, feeling foolish and grateful both, wondering what those men at the sale barn had seen that I wasn't seeing, or what I had that they didn't. That was when I heard the truck. Dale Amory drove a green 1965 Ford pickup with a dented tailgate, and I heard it coming up the gravel a good half-mile off, that particular rattle his muffler made. He parked it at the fence line, didn't bother pulling in by the house, and walked over with his thumbs hooked in his belt, like he already owned the ground he was standing on. "Heard you kept him," he said, nodding at Ezra without really looking at him. "Heard you didn't sell at Stanford." I told him I hadn't decided yet. "Well, don't take too long deciding," he said. "That hoof's not getting better, and every day you feed him is a day you're losing money on a bull that's worth slaughter price at best." He said he could make some calls, said he knew a buyer over in Fergus County who'd take him off my hands quiet, no fuss, save me the embarrassment of hauling him back to another sale where folks would just talk. He said it kind, almost, like he was doing me a favor. Then he looked past me at the house, at the barn roof sagging on the north side, at the fence line that needed mending for a half-mile in either direction, and he said, 640 acres is a lot of ground for one boy. Son, your grandfather ran this with 2 hired men, and 40 years of knowing what he was doing. You got neither." I didn't answer him. I just kept my hand on Ezra's shoulder, feeling the animal breathe slow and steady beneath my palm, and I thought about the wooden tag with my grandfather's handwriting on it, and wondered what else he'd written down that Dale Amory didn't know about. Dale's truck was still throwing dust down the county road when I went back inside, and the house felt different with him gone. Quieter, in the particular way a room gets quiet after somebody's said something true you didn't want to hear. I told myself I needed the co-op paperwork anyway, the renewal forms for the feed account that Vernon Talcott over at the Consolidated Farmers Co-op had been asking after since the first of the month, and my grandfather kept everything like that in the roll-top desk in the front room, the one with the brass pulls gone green at the edges. It was Tuesday, the 8th of October, and the light coming through the west window had that low slant it gets in Montana in the fall. Thin and gold, and already halfway to winter. I pulled the desk drawers one at a time. Tax receipts. A stack of Farmers Union newsletters going back to 1951. A cigar box of harness buckles nobody had used since the last team was sold in '49. And then, at the bottom of the deep drawer, under a folded horse blanket that smelled like cedar and machine oil, a leather notebook. It wasn't large, smaller than a Bible, bigger than a checkbook, bound in a dark, cracked leather gone soft at the corners, and it had a little brass hasp on the front, with a lock the size of my thumbnail. No key with it. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of the pages inside, and on the flyleaf, visible through a gap where the hasp had pulled loose from the leather just enough to peek in, I could make out my grandfather's handwriting, cramped and slanted the way it always was, and a date at the top, 1938. I worked the hasp with my pocket knife until it gave, and the pages fell open on their own, like they'd been waiting on that particular crease for 20 years. Names. Cattle names, dozens of them, written in columns. Marigold, Pilot, Duchess, Two-Bar Tom, with dates beside each one going back further than I could account for. Some crossed out entirely with a single hard line, some circled twice, some marked with a small letter K that meant nothing to me. Beside a few of the names he'd written notes so short they read like code. Hold back, do not cross, woof, pilot line, watch the feet. I sat there at the desk a long time with the light going from gold to gray, reading names of animals that had died before I was born, trying to make sense of a system only one man had ever understood, and I thought about Ezra out in the pen, with his split hoof and his tag reading foundation stock, and I thought, this book knows why. I didn't know yet what I was looking for. I only knew that somewhere in those cramped columns, going back to a year I couldn't picture except in old photographs, my grandfather had been keeping track of something he never once mentioned to me, and that whatever it was, it hadn't stopped mattering the day he died. I found the cigar box 2 nights later, on the Thursday, when I finally worked up the nerve to go through the rest of the roll-top desk instead of just the one drawer. It was a King Edward box, corners gone soft with handling, sitting under a stack of seed catalogs from companies that didn't exist anymore. Inside there wasn't tobacco, there were rubber bands gone to dust, a couple of Indian head pennies, a church fan from a funeral home in Roundup, and taped to the underside of the lid, so that I almost missed it entirely, a small brass key no longer than my thumb. It took me until Saturday to find what it opened. The notebook itself had a little brass lock set into the spine, so small I hadn't even registered it as a lock. I'd thought it was decoration, the kind of thing you'd find on a girl's diary, not a rancher's ledger. I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high, because the bulb over the stove had burned out, and I hadn't replaced it, and I fit the key in, and it turned soft and easy, like it had been oiled recently, though by whom I couldn't say. My grandfather had been dead 11 weeks. What opened up wasn't a diary. It was rules. Page after page, in that same cramped hand, he'd written out what he wouldn't allow. No animal with a white switch tail bred back into the line. No bull, under 4 years old, covering more than a dozen cows in a season, regardless of what the co-op men said about efficiency. Any calf born with a particular curl to the ear, he'd drawn it, a little sketch no bigger than a fingernail, was to be sold off within the year, never kept, never bred, no matter how good it looked otherwise. He called these ones drift. Not bad stock, not sick stock. Drift. As if the whole herd were a river he was trying to keep running one direction, and every year some current wanted to pull it sideways, and every year he stood in the water and pushed it back. There was no explanation anywhere in those pages for why. No mention of money, no mention of prizes, no mention of any breeder or buyer or fair ribbon that might have justified 40 years of a man quietly culling his own herd against what looked, on paper, like good sense and good money. He'd turned away sales. I found 3 separate years circled in red, where he'd noted refusing offers, decent offers, $50, $60 over market, because the animal in question carried the ear curl, or the white switch, or whatever else violated the line he never once wrote the reason for. I closed the notebook and sat with my hand flat on the cover for a while, the lamp hissing faintly, the house gone quiet around me, the way it did after 10 o'clock. And I understood that whatever this was, it hadn't been a hobby. It had been a devotion, and devotions like that don't start from nothing. I drove out to Pearlie Voss's place the next morning, a Tuesday, the second week of March, the kind of cold that sits under your collar and doesn't move. He'd worked for my grandfather on and off since before my father was born, and now he lived alone in a 2-room house with a coffee pot that never seemed to leave the stove. He was 81 that year, or claimed to be, and his hands shook, pouring the cups, but steadied the moment he set them down. I told him about the notebook, the red circles, the refused offers. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked out the window at the fence line, like it owed him an answer. "You want to know about the bull calf," he said, not a question. I said I did. He told it slow, the way old men tell things they've decided are worth telling right. Said it was the fall of 1934, dry as a stove lid, half the county selling off what stock they had left because there wasn't grass enough to keep it standing. A rancher named Elias Torvald had died that August. Heart, not dust, though everyone said the dust got him first. And his widow was running an estate sale out past Conrad, 100 head or better going for whatever anybody'd pay. "Your grandfather went with 3 good steers," Pearlie said. "Fat ones. Steers a man could have sold in Great Falls for real money that year. And real money wasn't nothing in 34. Believe you me." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, like he was aiming it. He come home with 1 bull calf, scrawny thing, legs like a colt still finding its feet. Everybody at that sale thought Otis had gone simple in the head, trading 3 fat steers for 1 calf that looked like it might not see January. Why'd he do it? Pearlie shrugged, and it wasn't the shrug of a man who didn't know. It was the shrug of a man deciding how much to say. Torvald kept a line nobody else in this county was keeping. Old stock. Come up from someplace back east, further back than that. I never got the whole of it. Otis knew him some. They talked cattle the way some men talk scripture. He looked at me then, direct, the way he hadn't yet that morning. Whole town called it the worst trade made in Pondera County that year. Called it for 20 years after, matter of fact. Your grandfather never once argued the point. He drank his coffee like that settled something, and outside the window the wind picked up along the fence line, and I sat there turning it over. 3 good steers, for 1 bad-looking calf, and 40 years of a man protecting whatever came after, and I understood I hadn't even gotten to the middle of it yet. I drove home with that thought riding beside me like a passenger, and I didn't sleep well that night. And Wednesday after chores, I went up into the loft where I'd been told as a boy not to poke around, back when the ladder rungs were still solid, and my grandfather still stood at the bottom of them watching. The rungs had gone soft in 2 places since, and I tested each one with my boot before I trusted my weight to it. The loft smelled the way it always had. Dry hay gone to dust, old leather, a mouse nest somewhere I never did find. I worked along the rafters with a flashlight my grandfather had left in the tack room, the kind with the square battery that costs more than the light's worth, and on the 3rd rafter from the west wall, I found where somebody had nailed a scrap of shiplap crosswise, not for any structural reason I could see, just enough to hide a tin box wedged behind it. It was a Hills Brothers coffee tin, the kind with the man in the yellow robe on the lid, and the lock on it was a small brass padlock gone green at the hasp. I had to work it loose with a screwdriver, and when the lid finally gave, dust came off it like breath. Inside was a photograph, brittle at the corners, curling the way old paper does when it's been damp once and dried slow. 1938 was written on the back in pencil, in handwriting smaller and more careful than the writing in the ledger. The photograph showed a mixed little herd, standing loose in a pole corral I didn't recognize, maybe 8 or 9 head, and even in the gray of it, I could see they didn't match. Some rangy and narrow-hipped, some blocky through the shoulder, one with a hump at the withers like nothing I'd ever seen grazing this county. Under the photograph was a folder of correspondence, typed on onion skin paper gone yellow, letterhead from the State Agricultural College up at Bozeman, dated across several years I hadn't sorted through yet. And under that, folded twice and soft at the creases from handling, was a set of registry papers, the kind with a seal stamped faint and official in the corner, referencing a bloodline I'd never heard spoken by anyone in this county. Criollo descended, the paper said, foundation stock, numbers so small in one column that I read it 3 times thinking I'd misread a decimal. I sat down right there in the loft dust with the tin box open on my knees and the flashlight balanced against a hay bale, and I understood that whatever Otis Torvald had traded 3 good steers for at that sale in 1938, it hadn't ended with him. It had kept going, quiet, through a man who never once argued that he'd made the worst trade in Pondera County, because he knew something the whole town didn't. I drove into town on Thursday, the 22nd of October, with the tin box wedged on the seat beside me, and the truck heater ticking, like it always did before it decided whether to work at all that day. I had the registry papers in a manila envelope so the wind through the vent wouldn't get at them, and I had my grandfather's notebook, and I had the little brass tag I'd clipped off the bull's ear the week before, the one with the number stamped so worn I'd needed a magnifying glass off my grandmother's sewing kit to be sure of the last 2 digits. The extension office sat 2 doors down from the feed store, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign that hadn't been touched up since before I was born. The geneticist was there on a Thursday, because Thursdays were when she came down from Great Falls to look at soil samples for the co-op, and I'd caught her before she left, standing in the little front room with a coffee cup that said, Mosu Extension Service, in blue letters, gone pale from washing. She didn't say much at first. She laid the correspondence out on the counter, in the order I handed it to her, and she read slower than I would have liked, running her finger along lines of type like she was checking her own memory against the page. Then she took the tag from my palm without asking, and held it up to the window light, turning it so the stamped numbers caught at an angle. She went back to the folder, flipped 2 pages, went back to the tag again. This last correspondence, she said, from 1954. It lists an animal transferred under a private arrangement, no public registry filing, just a courtesy notation to the college, so the line wouldn't be lost to the records entirely. She tapped the page. The number here. She held the tag beside it. Same number. I didn't say anything. I don't think I trusted my voice yet. Your grandfather, she said, wasn't just keeping a bull. He was keeping a promise to a man named Otis Torvald that he'd carry a bloodline forward that the rest of the state had let go extinct decades ago, and he never told a soul, near as I can tell, because there was nothing to gain by telling, and everything to lose if the wrong buyer got interested in the wrong year. She looked up at me then, steady, the way she'd looked at the bull's hoof over the rail that first morning. 36 years, she said, give or take, quietly, through drought and through the war, and through every sale barn in this county, laughing at whatever he brought to market that didn't look like the rest. I thought about the crossed-out names in the ledger, the years without a single dollar figure written beside them, and I understood, standing there in that pale brick office with the coffee going cold on the counter, that I hadn't finished reading my grandfather's book at all. The telephone in the kitchen started ringing on a Tuesday, the 9th of September, and it didn't stop for 10 days. First call came from a man out of Fergus County. Said he'd heard through a fellow at the extension office that there was a Torvald line bull standing on a place near the mussel shell. And was it true, and could he come look? I hadn't told anyone but the geneticist and Mrs. Halverson at the co-op counter, and somehow by that Friday there were 2 more calls, one from Judith Basin, a woman with a clipped, businesslike voice who asked about semen collection before she asked about price, and one from a rancher outside Cascade County who said his father had bought stock from Otis Torvald back before the war, and he'd wondered his whole life what became of that blood. I wrote their names in the back of the ledger, under my grandfather's crossed-out entries, because it seemed like the place they belonged. On the 6th day, a Sunday, a truck I knew came up the drive slower than usual, and Amory got out without his hat, which I noticed because he never went anywhere without it. He stood by the pen a long while before he said anything, watching the bull chew, watching the hoof that had healed crooked but healed clean. 4,000, he said. Cash. I can have the check written by Wednesday. I asked him why the number had climbed so far past slaughter weight in under 2 weeks. He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the tag clipped in the bull's ear. The little aluminum marker I'd stopped even noticing was there, and something in his face told me before his mouth did. I saw that number back in July, he said, at the sale barn. Didn't mean anything to me then. But it did later. Later, I asked around. I thought about the folded paper he'd slid across my kitchen table in June. The number he'd called generous. The way he'd told me a boy my age had no business keeping an animal that couldn't walk straight. I thought about how long he must have known, or half known, or suspected, before he ever said a word about slaughter price. I appreciate you driving out, I said, and left it there. The way my grandfather might have. The way the ledger had taught me a man could say no without raising his voice. He put his hat back on before he got in the truck. He didn't look angry so much as tired, like a man who'd bet on the wrong outcome and was doing the arithmetic in his head on the drive home. I watched the dust settle behind his taillights and went back to the barn, where the bull stood waiting, patient as anything, like he already knew the offer wasn't the one that mattered. The co-op deadline sat on my calendar in my grandfather's own hand, penciled into the March page before he died, like he'd known I'd need the reminder more than he would. 6 weeks had become 5, then 4, and Amory's number, even after his truck disappeared down the county road for good, kept surfacing in my head at night, the way a debt does when you're lying still and the house is quiet, and there's nothing to distract you from the arithmetic. I drove into Miles City on a Tuesday, the 11th, and sat in the extension office across from the same geneticist who'd leaned over my rail in July. She had a stack of letters on her desk now, 3 inches thick, from breeders in Custer County, in Rosebud, one all the way from up near Glasgow. She laid out what a stud contract could look like: a flat fee per breeding, a deposit up front, my bull staying on my ground the whole time, which mattered to me more than I let on. You don't have to sell anything, she said. You just have to be patient about the money coming in, instead of all at once. Patient wasn't a word the co-op cared about. The feed bill wanted its $420 whole. Not in installments, not in promises. I did the numbers on the back of an envelope 3 separate times that week, and every time the stud deposits came up short of what Amory had offered outright, at least in the first month, it would have been so easy to fold. Easy to drive back out to his place, shake his hand, take the check, and sleep that night without the ledger's weight pressing on my chest. I didn't do it. I wrote to 2 of the breeders instead, the ones with the most serious letters, the ones who asked real questions about hoof care and feed, and whether the limp affected his temperament, rather than just his price. I told them the truth about all of it, the split hoof, the drooling, the way he'd looked half-ruined at the sale barn in July. Neither one backed off. One sent a deposit of $60 by return mail before I'd even finished writing back. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open beside the envelope of new numbers, watching them not quite add up to what the co-op wanted, and further from what Amory had offered. And I thought about my grandfather doing this same math 40 years earlier, choosing the slow way because it was the only way that left the herd whole in the end. By the second week of October, the deposits kept coming, small envelopes with return addresses in Fergus County and Judith Basin, and one from Clear Over in Sweetgrass, each one carrying $20, $40, once $110, from a widow named Marsh, who wrote that her late husband had bred back to that same foundation line in 1951 and never forgot it. I kept a running tally in pencil on the inside cover of my own notebook, the way I'd seen my grandfather do in his, and on the 4th of November, a Tuesday, the number crossed $2,000. By the following Monday, it sat at $2,140, the exact figure the co-op letter had demanded 6 weeks before, not a dollar short. I drove into town and paid Emmett Luce in full, watched him stamp the account closed in red ink, and didn't say much of anything on the walk back to the truck, because there wasn't a word that felt big enough. The new farrier, a quiet man from over toward Grass Range named Holt, came out twice that month to work on the bull's hoof, trimming it slow and packing it with something that smelled of pine tar and iodine, wrapping it clean each time. By the middle of November, the drooling had eased, and the limp had shortened into something closer to a favor than a wound, and the bull, Ezra, I'd taken to calling him out loud finally, the name my grandfather had given him in the ledger, stood steadier in the pen than I'd seen him stand since July. Some evenings after chores, I'd sit on the upturned bucket in the barn, with the lamp turned low and the notebook open across my knee, reading the same entries I'd read a dozen times already, except now they read different. The line about keeping ease get separate, don't let Amory's stock cross the fence, wasn't caution anymore. It was strategy. The note about the hoof will heal if the leg's given time, same as anything worth keeping, wasn't sentiment. It was instruction, written by a man who'd nursed this same bloodline through worse, before I was born. I understood now why he'd never sold off, why he'd let the herd shrink small enough to look like failure to anyone driving past on the county road. He'd been protecting something the rest of the valley had forgotten how to see. I was still sitting there with the lamp burning low when I heard tires on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. The kind of engine sound I'd learned by now belonged to only one truck in the county. That truck idled at the gate a long moment before the engine cut, and by the time I stepped out with the lamp still in my hand, the man leaning against the door hadn't come to offer anything. He looked at the bull through the rail, at the way the leg had healed clean and square, and he didn't say much beyond a nod and a comment about the grass on my North 40 needing rotating. I told him I'd get to it. That was the last time he came around asking about buying anything of mine. The calls kept coming that autumn. A rancher out of Miles City, 2 more from down near the Wyoming line, all wanting a look at the bull's papers, all wanting to talk terms for a season's breeding before the ground froze. I didn't sell him. I bred him out instead, 4 cows that first year, then more the next, and by the 2nd September, the pens behind the barn held 6 calves with his same broad chest, and, in 2 of them, that same faint hitch in the back left step that the vet in town called cosmetic now, not disqualifying. It was the 2nd Saturday of September, 1972, when I brought him back to the same sale grounds outside Stanford, where a year before the auctioneer wouldn't even run him through the ring. He stood in the holding pen that afternoon, steady on all 4 feet, dust-settled gold in the late light. 3 of his calves penned close by, drawing more attention from the rail than I'd ever seen aimed my way. Men who wouldn't look at me 12 months before were leaning over that same fence now, notebooks out, asking about lineage. I still have the ledger. I keep it in the same drawer my grandfather kept it in, and some nights I add a line of my own beneath his, in the same plain hand, because that's what you do with a thing that isn't finished yet. So if you've been told you're too young, too green, too soft for the work sitting in front of you, I'd tell you to go look in the place nobody's opened in 40 years. The flaw everybody's laughing at might be the whole reason the thing survived this long. Mine had a split hoof and a bloodline nobody remembered how to read. Yours might be a notebook, a name in a ledger, an animal standing crooked in somebody's back pasture that everyone else has already given up on. If this is the kind of story you come back for, stay around. There's more where this came from. And if your family's got a barn or a drawer nobody's opened, tell me about it below. I'd like to hear it.